Hi everyone. In this lesson we're going to look at arithmetic sequences specifically so that we can get a little bit better at figuring out how to predict their patterns without necessarily having to do a lot of work. The questions that you're going to see today on page 7 are all arithmetic, and every one of them has something in common. That we're going to be given a couple of terms but a bunch of gaps in between, and we're going to have to figure out what's missing so that we can connect the pattern. Now, in question number 1, we're going to end up talking about some strategies that you'll end up applying in questions 2 and 3 on your own. So just to give you a heads up about what this series of lessons is going to look like, or this series of videos is going to look like, I'm going to spend the majority of our time focusing on question number 1, and we're going to use it as an example so that you can do questions 2 and 3 gradually more independently. So be prepared for this playlist of videos to be a little bit more traditional in that I'll give you some of the information and I'll have you try to figure out the rest by using a little bit more independent thinking, and of course using the answer key if you feel like you need it. So just kind of be prepared for that. This playlist is going to seem like it's going to have some gaps in it, but only because I'm going to ask you to do a little bit more independent work this time to try to put together the pieces on your own. Now, of course, I definitely won't send you off on your own without some structure. So we're going to start with question number 1 and really try to talk through it in as much depth as we can so that when you're on your own, you have number 1 to use as a guide. In question number 1, it says, assume the sequence is arithmetic. Why is it difficult to tell what the sequence's adder is just by looking at the table? Well, I'm going to look at the table and I'm going to see if I can predict what exactly they must be talking about. We know it has an adder, but I have to get from 12 to something to 96. Well, that is kind of hard to figure out what we're adding by because the gap from 12 to 96 is so big. So you can put this into your own words, but I'll say an answer for letter A that you can either pause the video and copy down, or you can interpret in your own words when you have time. I think it's going to be difficult to predict the adder because the gap is so big. The distance from 12 to 96 is really far. So just guessing a number to me sounds like a really intimidating task. And that's my best answer for letter A. It's going to be hard because I have such a big gap between the terms in the sequence. 12 to 96, that's a huge gap. I'm definitely concerned about that. Now in letter B, let's take into account what's possible. If we're going to have to do a problem with a big gap, what are our options? Letter B is wondering, could we just guess and check possible adders until we find the right one? We did do a guess and check style strategy in the previous lesson. Would that work here? The question is, discuss the pros and cons. I'm going to give you some time because I want you to really think about the pros and cons for yourself. I can only speak for me, but what I might perceive as a possible pro, you might think, oh, Herbert, I don't want to do it that way. That sounds like a con to me. That sounds bad. And the way you might be thinking to do it might be different than somebody else sitting there in their own house right now thinking totally differently. So we're all going to come at this question, letter B, from very different perspectives. And I want you to try to answer it from your perspective. What if you had to guess and check how to get from 12 to something to 96? What could be some possible pros to that? Maybe it's easy because guessing is something that you're good at. Maybe it's something that you can do because you have a calculator that does really quick adding or something like that. Maybe those are possible pros that you can take into account. Now, some people might not have a calculator. That would be a con for them. Guess and check would be too hard without a calculator. Some people don't have patience. So guess and check is definitely a con just on its own nature because they don't have the patience to guess and check. They're terrible at guessing and checking. So again, everybody's going to have to answer this question for themselves because there's no right answer to pros and cons. For myself, I can say that the pros are that guessing is easy. I didn't need to know any fancy steps, but the con is it takes patience and it takes time. And usually we don't want to take a lot of time for a question. I know that if I make a video too long, people are going to stop watching it. So that to me is a con. If it's going to take me 10 minutes to finally guess the right number, I'll probably have lost all of you as viewers. So that doesn't sound that good. But I'm going to ask you to take a couple of moments and to think what might be some pros and cons. Between now and the time you start the next video, weigh out your possible pros and cons and decide. If you have enough pros to say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to try guessing and checking, then I want you to stop, skip the next video, and do everything that you can to finish question number 1 by guessing and checking until you find the pattern. If you don't have the patience for guess and check after you've made your pros and con lists and realized, nah, I don't want to do it that way, then tune into the next video and I'll walk you through another way you can do it without guess and check.